Yep, we're good.
All right, we get started at 6:32. Can I get a motion to enter public session?
I'll make a motion to enter public session.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
We're in public session. Can I get roll call, please?
Mrs. Jaskula,
Here.
Mr. Luke,
Here.
Mr. Smexton,
Here.
Mr. Hoffman,
Here.
Mr. Rahman.
We stand for pledge of allegiance. Pledge of allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Comments from the public on agenda items. Just a reminder for those members of the public in attendance, this is one of two opportunities afforded to members of the public to comment on or inquire about agenda items. Members of the public also have an opportunity at the end of the evening's agenda to comment on matters not formally noted on the agenda. We appreciate your participation. Anybody have anything? No, we just got on the button. If anybody wants to email us comments, they can send them to voecomments@mans.org.
Quick side. Sometimes, usually I feel like this is lit up, but it sounds like today. I don't know if that's a thing.
I'm getting volume from you guys, so we should be good.
All right, great.
Thank you, though. I appreciate it. I appreciate it.
All right, number 2, discussion items, superintendent's reports and updates. I'm sorry, approval of minutes. Thank you. I remember that. Could I get a item up for approval of minutes? Could I get a resolution, please?
Be it resolved by the Board of Education of the New Hampshire School District accept the minutes of the November 10th, 2025 meeting.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. All right, now discussion items, superintendent's reports.
So to begin, we have Mr. Schwartz here from Bernie Donegan's office to our annual long-range financial plan presentation, and then he'll be available to answer any questions for the board as he goes through that.
Good evening, everybody. As Jen said, my name is Jason Schwartz. I'm the president of Donegan Incorporated. We're the district's financial advisor, so we help with capital projects and also do the 5-year long-range plan update that we've done over the last couple of years. We're not going to do the presentation here, but I did also hand out hard copies to everybody before the meeting. It's easier to look on that way. So going into the first slide of the report, just as a refresher for everybody, or if anybody hasn't seen this presentation before about what a long-range plan is and why we do it. So really we're taking a look over the next 5 years and making some estimates based on historical trends and other data inputs on projected revenues and expenditures to get an idea of where the district's financial position is. It's really a helpful tool to help you with assessing kind of future commitments, whether they be programmatic, capital needs, things like that, and seeing the the impacts of that or the availability of funds to be able to do things like that. And they're not static documents, they're things we want to update frequently. That's why we come each year and do this presentation. Because a lot can change year to year in New York State school finance, especially with aid projections and how that all plays out with the budget. There's been a lot of movement over the last couple of years. Coming out of COVID, you had talks of aid cuts, then there was the stimulus funding. Now that we're reevaluating foundation aid throughout the state, so just a constantly moving target. So it's good to update it every year. And then one key distinction is that the long range plan is a little bit different than your budget, right? So it can be a good, useful tool to help you in building your budget, but it is not the same as your budget, right? So you don't want to just take these numbers we're talking about tonight and plot them into your budget. We're trying to be a little bit more, a little less conservative, I guess, if you want to say it that way. When we do a long range plan, we're trying to hone in a little bit more on realistic expectations versus when you build your budget, you might have to be a little more conservative because you never know what's going to come up during the year, right? If there's an emergency project, some new students move into the district and have special ed needs, things like that. You can't increase your budget once it's been voted, so you sometimes will have to be a little bit more conservative when you build the budget and just be mindful of it throughout the year. So going into the next couple slides, we're going to just do a quick update before we get into the future projections, just on where things stand with capital, since that is a big piece of what we manage for the district as well. So currently in the 2 open capital projects, so we have the May of 23 vote. There was originally 2.6 million plus, or I guess 2.2 million plus there was the grants that have been added on top of that, the SAMS grants. So that project is pretty much wrapped up now. We just issued the bond, or had the sale for the bond, right before Thanksgiving. We got a phenomenal rate. You see in the blue box there, about 2.83% for a 10-year bond, which is, kind of wild that that's, you got a 10-year bond for less than you had gotten a note for a 1-year note back in June. So that's a great rate that you got. Based on where rates are and the projected age, we were able to shorten that bond. Originally, we were going to plan to have that be 15 years, but we issued it for only 10 years. So you get some savings from that in terms of not paying interest for those extra 5 years and paying the principal back faster. And then the last piece of this project is once that bond closes, then we can issue the final cost report, which gets the aid flowing to kind of match that, close that service payments that have come back. So everything turned out great on that project, and that is pretty much wrapped up by the end of the month. Everything should be completely settled on that one. Going to the next project, the more recent vote from this past May, the $6.7 million capital project. So the timeline here is again just kind of what we were assuming in the pre-referendum process in terms of going through, getting the SCD approval around next summer, and then really looking at like summers of 27 and 28 to actually do the work. There has been some discussion about whether you might be able to get some work done in the summer of 26. SCD review times are down significantly, so I know the architect has been looking at that as a possibility. So if that were to happen, that borrowing might move back up a year to help cash flow some of that work that starts in 26. But as of right now, this is kind of where that one stands. It's still in the design and it's the middle of SCD phase, and then once the construction starts, then we'll get going on borrowings for that project. So going to the next page is the update on the summary. So this is a picture of all of your outstanding debt and aid associated with that debt. So this accounts for, this does account for the results of the sale from the 2023 vote. So that has already been updated in here. And that has the projections from pre-referendum for the current capital project. So the big thing, again, that we focus in on this page, and if you can click it, there should be an animation of how for on that right-hand side, that local share, so that's what you're raising in the tax levy for your projects, and that's a piece of the tax cap calculation that we'll talk about a little later. So we really try to manage that and keep that as level as we can. So you can see we've been staying level the last couple of years. We are anticipating a slight increase when the impact of the 2025 vote comes on. So that's where you see vote to the 411,000. And then just kind of looking out into the future for planning purposes, we do have our next drop off from the retiring debt in 2035 and 2036. So that would be probably like around a 2032 or 33 vote that would fit into that drop off. Or in the meantime, if you had things you need to do in the interim time, we could also look at doing a smaller capital project that's funded from capital reserves for local share. We don't want any tax impact, which is what that 2023 vote that we're wrapping up right now was. That was a small project that was the local share was just funded from capital reserves that you've been able to put away. Okay, so moving on to the next page. This is just a graphical look at that same information, and then on the next slide is an arrow. Again, that's where that drop off is from some of the retiring debt in the future, where essentially that space under the black bars where we can kind of fill in and have no tax increase if we just replace retiring debt with a new project. Okay, so then getting into the future projections. Before we start to project out for the next 5 years, we always like to start by doing a look back at the last couple of years' fund balances and see how we've been going, along. Have we had deficits over the last couple of years that indicate we might already be in a structural deficit or anything like that? So you can see all the different categories of fund balance, really focusing on the bottom line, which is above that dashed line. You see that district has been able to generate some small surpluses the last couple of years, so that's good news. That's what we like to see. That shows that you're in a healthy position right now in terms of managing your operating budget and putting right about 500,000 each of the last 2 years is a good solid operating surplus that you've had. One thing we did have highlighted here is just that capital reserve. So that's what we were talking about. I know you could always kind of set that aside for future projects when that return debt is, or also again that's money that's available for that if you had anything you have to do in process. Going to the next page, so starting to get into some of the 5-year projections. So we'll talk about the overall revenue picture in a minute, but we always like to start by breaking out state aid separately because there is so much that goes into that. So you can see all the different categories of the state aid years. So the first 2 years are off of the latest state aid runs. There should be new state aid runs out any day. We've been waiting for those for a while now, I believe. So hopefully those are up soon. But since we don't have those, you'll see 26, 27 in the next 5 years out. We're making assumptions. So basically the key assumptions from this page on the top line foundation aid, we projected that to stay flat over the next couple of years. So that was kind of the middle ground between historically there are increases in foundation aid, usually like 2 to 3% per year. But there has been discussion about hold harmless being removed from foundation aid at some point in the near future. So if that were to happen, you also have the possibility of losing some aid because the district is on hold harmless. There's about a couple $100,000 out of that 1.5 million that you're currently getting. So that was kind of the middle ground between those historical increases and the risk of the hold harmless going away. Just project that out flat. All your other aids in the categories there are expense-based aids, we call them. So we've assumed that the state aid would remain flat going on in the future, basically saying if you continue to use the same types of services for textbooks, technology, OCs, all that, transportation, they continue to generate similar aid. And then in the highlight down on the bottom 2 rows, those numbers are all pulling from what we went through at the start of the report in terms of our projections. So you can see, if you click through, there should be 2 animations just highlighting where that first green box is where the aid is going to start flowing on the current project that we're closing out. So you see your aid jumps up from 441 to 593,000, which is to line up with an associated increase in debt service from the bond we just issued. And then that second green arrow is where we're currently projecting the aid would start for the new project that was voted in May of 2025. So we did update these projections, just keeping them flat. We're projecting based off of what we know on your capital projects.
I'm sorry, can you hold on for a second? I just got a text from Vanessa that the sound is bad. Is the sound going through your computer maybe? If this is off? Said you can't hear Jason.
It's coming through there.
You can tell it's coming through this thing.
Yeah, it's set to.
All right, we can go.
So then moving on to the next page, looking at the overall revenue picture here. So again, here are all your revenue categories. Really the main thing to call attention to is in the box at the top there, you see those blue figures. That is the projected tax levy increases we're assuming in this report, which is basically going right to your tax cap. So we have a page a little later on that shows where we're projecting what the tax cap is for the next 5 years. So this is assuming you go right to the projected cap each year, which is somewhere between low 2s to low 3s, depending on a couple of other factors with your capital, pilots, growth factors, things like that. State aid again is pulling from what we just went through, and then there are a couple other categories in here, but they're relatively smaller pieces. We're just kind of keeping similar assumptions in terms of the revenues. For other services like your self-contained class and tuition, and then charges for services for interest earnings, keeping that relatively flat. There was some talk about rate cuts, which could take those down, but we're being relatively conservative there right now compared to what we got for the prior year. So those are good numbers. In the bottom right-hand corner, the green circle there, you can see basically when you add it all together, the increase in revenues projected over the next 5 years is 2.22%. So if you put a pin in that, we'll talk about that in a minute when we get to the expense side, but that's what we're projecting for revenue growth. And then when we get to the expenditure side on the next page, so again, this is kind of like a 10,000 foot level with your budget. Obviously, there's a lot of different categories that roll into this. We're just looking at salaries, other operational costs, benefits, debt service, all that. So these are all projecting out over the next 5 years based on historical levels, what we know about your debt that we've already talked about, things like that. And when we get to the bottom right-hand corner again, you can see that that average change in the expense side of the budget is almost 3.5%. So that's this concept that we talked about, that really all school districts are in the same boat, that you have expenditures going up at a relatively high pace. You know, inflation's still a little higher over the last couple of years. Obviously, a big piece of your expenditure budget is the school district, is your people. So, you know, trying to remain competitive with salaries, and just, you know, we're all familiar with the pressure on health insurance costs right now. So all those factors put together create a rising expenditure budget that you have a hard time keeping up with when you don't have any control over your state aid and you're capped on what you can do with your taxes, you know, within the tax cap. So when we get to the next page, looking at your fund balances. So this is basically a summary page of that, and on the top half you see the summaries of the revenues and expenses from the prior pages. And what you see there as you go across is the red numbers, and that they continue. Those expenses are going up at a higher pace than the revenues are. So that's not an uncommon picture to see for a school district. Again, you've been able to generate $500,000 surpluses the last 2 years. So hopefully, if you continue to kind of manage your budget well each year, maybe things turn out a little better than this. But it is something to be aware of, that there's going to continue to be more pressure on the budget each year. But because you've had those good surpluses the last couple of years and have had good financial, sound financial management, you're starting from a strong position where when you look at the bottom of your fund balances, you got 3.3 million, which is a good percentage of your annual operating budget. So even though you have these projected deficits the next couple of years, you do have a good savings account, if you want to call it that, with your fund balances, that you have some time to be able to manage those. So you want to be aware of the commitments you're making, because you don't want to accelerate those deficits more than they're currently projected to be. So being mindful of what you're doing with the tax levy each year, being mindful of long-term expenditure commitments. But you can see when you look at that bottom line, you're staying in the positive overall in terms of total fund balance until the last year of the 5-year projections. So that's obviously it's always eye-opening to see the red on there, but that's a pretty common story for most school districts. And in many cases, when we do these reports, it's even in like the 3rd or 4th year you start to see those red figures. So that it tells a story that you're in a good and sound financial position right now, and you just have to continue to manage it going forward and try to keep it that way. Going to the next page, again, there you can see that the total deficits as we're going. Okay, so on the next page, this is the projected tax cap. 26-27 should be pretty realistic at this point, because we do have the tax-based growth factors been announced. So a lot of the levy factor hasn't been announced yet, but that seems pretty safe to be the 2% where inflation is right now. So that roughly 2.14% should be a pretty good number for this coming year, but that'll be finalized for you in the next couple of weeks here, probably. The future years going out, we're projecting based off of like 5-year historical averages. So those ones will likely change a little bit, but they should be relatively good, ballpark estimates. And the key thing on this page to look at is right in the middle of the page. Again, we're going to the cap and not exceeding it. So this 5-year plan can be done without needing to do any majority votes to exceed your tax cap. And the next page right here, so this is just a summary we provided each year, and I think it's a good, helpful reminder, especially as you go into your budget process, of the impacts of not going to the cap, right? Obviously, everybody would love to keep taxes flat if you could. You don't necessarily want to raise them, but when you are capped, anything you leave on the table starts to have a compounding effect in future years. So this is just a good example of that for you. So on the top half of the page is the tax levy that you would raise if you go to the cap, like what is it in a long-range plan. And in the middle is saying if we didn't go all the way to the cap, if we just did 2%, which is a figure we use because that's, everybody calls it the 2% tax cap, even though it's not really 2%. If we just win at 2%, as like just as an example, the money we're leaving on the table by not going to those maximum caps turns into, in the bottom right-hand corner, $885,000 of uncollected tax levy that you could have raised within the cap. Which again, if you think back to that fund balance page that we were looking at a minute ago, when we're getting to that red in the last year, if we're not going right to the cap, that red starts to push forward, and you start to see that in year 3 or year 4 because of these revenues that we've left on the table. So that's just always a good reminder as you go into it to be mindful. Obviously, you always have to consider everything you know about the district and the pressures that you're under. But just knowing what that impact is and how that affects you if you don't go to that cap, realistically, that starts to pull the numbers forward, and you might have to look at a supermajority tax levy at some point in the future if you're trying to, remain in that strong financial position. And so just to summarize and wrap up again on the next page, so really as you look at those red numbers from that fund balance page, those deficits that are projected in that bottom line number 5 years out, how do you manage that? So really kind of 3 options for managing it are you increase revenues or decrease expenditures. Revenues, it's really hard to increase. The only way you really control it's a sizable number is your tax levy. And we're already going to the cap with these projections, so the only way you can raise them further would be to exceed the cap. So you're a little limited there. Expenditures, obviously, you have a little bit more control over. So looking at your program, your needs, your long-term spending commitments, where are there options for shared services with other districts, OCs, other municipalities, things like that. And then really where those 2 options, once you've kind of exhausted those, your other option is to use your reserves in your fund balance. So that savings that you've been able to build up over the last couple of years, where there are gaps, you can start to draw down on that. But the more you start using that, you have to be aware that there may be some decisions that have to be made in the future because that's not a long-term sustainable option. If you're using reserves or fund balance that doesn't replenish, and if it's not on a one-time expenditure, if it's on a annual operating expense, then it's going to continue to be something you have to consider each year in the future. It doesn't go away. So, any questions on that? I kind of went through it relatively quickly, but overall, I think it's a good picture. It seems like because of those surpluses you've been generating over the last year or 2, you're in better shape than you were at this point last year. So that's good news when we look at this and kind of compare it here when we come back and update.
What was that? Next page?
That's
sorry.
that's the presentation. Yeah.
Sorry.
So if there's any questions that we have,
For me?
Does anyone have a question? I know I've seen a few of these, so it makes sense to me. Hopefully it makes sense to you. Does anybody have any questions about the numbers or the process?
okay.
Thank you very much, Jason, appreciate it.
Thank you, Jason.
Feel free to not stay.
Okay.
Yeah.